Lovely. And I'll admit everybody now. Hello, everyone. Just waiting for the last few people to join us from the waiting room. Thanks so much for your patience. Lovely. Well, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It is my absolute pleasure to be here with you all this evening for this special launch of Inviting Nature to Dinner with Helen Schwencke and Dick Copeman. Before I hand you over to Helen and Dick this evening, I'd just like to very quickly reiterate some of the information that you were sent with your link to join tonight's event. So as you're all aware, you've been placed on mute and you will remain so throughout the evening until the very end, when I allow you to take yourselves off mute and join me in thanking Helen and Dick for tonight's discussion. But that doesn't mean that you can't ask questions. We definitely do take questions, and I encourage you to send them through as and when you think of them. Please use the chat box to send those through. You should be able to find it towards the bottom left of your screen. If you can't see it though, don't worry too much. I'm going to be posting the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Inviting Nature to Dinner in that chat box. And when I do, it will pop up. So you'll be able to see the space that you need to type your questions in then, and you can send them through to me as and when you think of them so that I can read them out towards the end of this evening. And so I would now like to introduce your speakers for this evening. Helen Schwencke is an ecologist, public speaker and publisher whose passion is introducing people to a whole new meaning of life through connecting them with nature, especially insects, and with growing food for biodiversity. She has a 33-year-old living garden laboratory for butterflies, other invertebrates and wildlife in inner Brisbane. Helen organised Woodfordia's Butterfly Project between 2004 and 2018 and is co-author of Create More Butterflies. Also speaking tonight is, of course, Dick Copeman. Dick is a former medico cum food and environmental activist who ended up growing Bushfoods and teaching permaculture at Northeast Street City Farm in Brisbane. His fascination with all things botanical falls just short of Helen's total immersion in all things ecological and entomological. And so, Helen and Dick, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you for tonight's presentation and discussion.
Thanks very much, Emma, Kate, and g'day everyone. It's good to have you all along tonight. We're just going to start off by, I'll be asking Helen a few questions and then she'll show a few images to illustrate her answers, and then she'll take over interviewing me and we'll do the same. So starting off, Helen, just a few questions which I've got to quickly pull up. Hang on a sec. First of all, Helen, perhaps you can tell us, everyone, how we got started in producing this book.
Yes, and thank you, Dick, and thank you, Emma, Kate, and thank you to Avid Reader for hosting the event and acknowledging the First Peoples of this land, particularly the areas that the book covers. And well, we actually got started on Bundjalung land, as I looked it up, behind Cunningham's Gap in May 2015, when both Dick and I were at a Queensland Naturalists Club camp. The host of that camp had long straight beds set out in a way that we've all been taught to grow our crops. One row was planted with kale, and we were looking at the cabbage whites that were paying attention to the kale and started talking about the ecology of what was happening. Cabbage whites had evolved millennia ago in Europe, basically to eat kale and related mustard plants, and they'd been introduced to Australia, all the cabbage family, where they've become established, and the butterfly has become established on their actual food plants in a new range. Our observations were that in any natural setting, few plants grow in isolation. So planting kale in rows is actually separated by mulch and by bare ground is actually an invitation to come and eat them. So Dick and I both clearly had complementary information and perspectives to share, and me with a long history of working with butterflies and other invertebrates, and Dick with his interest in plants, and both of us with an interest in ecology. And this led to further discussion where I suggested we work together and we could put our heads together to see what we'd come up with, and hence our book. Yeah, so that was the genesis of the discussion that's led to a book.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I mean, I think our interests and skills do complement each other. And this book is a real collaboration. Neither of us could have written it on our own. So the second question to you is why this particular book? And I'm holding up a copy and you've seen it on the screensaver at the beginning. So why this book, Helen?
Well, there's lots of books about insects, but not necessarily about the depth. Some focus on the types of animals that they are, so they're ID guides. Others are focused on letting us know from our very human-centered point of view whether they're friends or foes. And then there's the very detailed scientific publications and journal articles that are not accessible to many. At this stage, there are a few books, at least for a general audience, that look at the relationships between different animals and their roles and why it's important to know what they are, or books that are written from an ecological understanding of the importance of all these animals. And so with the rapidly growing concerns about species losses and the losses of insects and other small creatures are just starting to come into focus. So less understood even in those discussions is the amazing diversity and sheer numbers of species of these life forms on our beautiful little Earth. And our book is an endeavour to explain why it's so important to understand and consider these small creatures more closely. Our gardens and urban landscapes have changed really dramatically and exclude enormous numbers of these animals. And the vast bulk of them is harmless to us. So of these, the insects and other small creatures that eat local native plants are a basic link in complex food webs that sustain land-based habitats and ecosystems. Really, they're the food for birds and other animals that we're familiar with, and we need to bring back these complex food webs as much as possible wherever we've been modifying the landscape. And we actually need to do this to start teaching ourselves about complexity and to make a dent in the projected species losses happening now and ahead of us in the future. So we hope our book makes some good suggestions about this.
Thanks, Helen. So it really is a bit of a popular ecology or ecology for gardeners text. I mean, ecology without the stats and the equations. And yep. I think we'd both agree that ecology is the new black. Ecology is quite cool.
Yep. And we're trying to inject some actual ecological principles into an ecology discussion that sometimes doesn't actually understand them.
Right. So the next question, Helen, is this is a preview version. I was a bit puzzled by this initially. Can you explain to our audience what a preview version is?
Okay. Yeah, so the core message of the book is about the critical importance of starting to think about and plant local native species, from ground covers to canopy trees, and to create a healthy ecosystem in our urban areas, and to replace ornamental plants wherever possible. So the issue is that, and I'll explain, it'll become apparent later, our actual subject matter is vast, and it would have taken a very long time to produce a book that covered the territory that both, well, you and I wanted to cover. And if we'd taken that time, the core message of our book wouldn't have been available for discussion and promotion. So the preview, this preview edition is complete in and of itself, and is a sample of what would be or could be included in a forthcoming edition. But we want readers' feedback about what they'd like to know, because I mean, this thing could become multiple volumes with the diversity of species that there are on the planet that we need to be interacting with. And the other angle on it is that book publishing has changed, and the book is being produced and distributed through print on demand facility now. So there's no need any longer to do a big print run and have stock on hand. And we can take advantage of this to ask our audience about what they'd like to see included. And we can be very much more agile about producing a new edition and what gets included or not. So we're taking advantage of technological change.
Thanks, Helen. So this is really a bit of a taster, and we'd really love everyone out there to give us your feedback before we embark on a bigger and a better edition. So finally, Helen, why is there a bigger focus on butterflies and their food plants than on other insects and creatures in this book?
Well, insects that eat plants are at the base of all food webs. And of these, butterflies are the easiest to like. They don't sting or bite. And also they're colourful and day flying. And so they're the easiest to observe. And also their food plants are the best known of any of the different insect groups. And when I say food plants for butterflies, I mean for their caterpillars. Many of them are very easy to attract and you can get them breed in your garden. I actually call them FIFO jobs. Female butterflies fly in, lay some eggs on their particular caterpillar food plants, and then fly out looking for more of their host plants. And male butterflies fly in and fly out looking for females. So, butterfly species have very specific plants that they need for their next generation. And this is actually true for the vast majority of insect species on the planet. This phenomenon is called being a specialist. So no butterflies eat our vegetables except for the introduced cabbage white. There's a very small number of moths that are with caterpillars that eat a wider range of plants, and some of them have adapted to our introduced food plants. And these species are considered generalists, so they're fairly important ecological concepts. Even these generalists are usually limited to a much smaller range of food sources than we are. So we take ourselves as the key generalist. So understanding that butterflies are specialist feeders, their caterpillars are, makes them an excellent subject to learn about and to get started with. And also basically, this is the core knowledge base from which I've been expanding, because somebody gave me a butterfly hostplant list back in 1983. And I've also been demonstrating the concepts on my 16 perch, which is 405 square metre block in West End for the last 33 years. So growing the local native host plants is a great way to start learning about the importance of bringing local native plants back into our environment more generally. And the outcomes of all that learning is now encompassed in, the new book. So it looks like a book about butterflies, and it is a book about butterflies, but it's also about so much more. And will be even more in the next edition. So you need to share the slides if you can, Dick.
Yep, so we're just switching over so Helen can show you some photos.
Okay, and then yes, next screen, please. Can you move it on? Is it possible to move on? Okay.
There we go.
Bit of a lag time. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to be covering 3 topics. And they're the central concepts in inviting nature to dinner. Firstly, the vast bulk of animal species on Earth are small creatures that don't have backbones. They're known collectively as invertebrates. And since they can't stand up for themselves, we need to do it for them. So the second topic is that regarding the plant-eating insects and other invertebrates that are plant-eating, the big majority have specific food plants for their juvenile stages. And herbivorous insects are critical to all other life on Earth. And lastly, I'll address the premise of the book that we can make a big difference locally in our gardens and landscapes and through revegetation work by planting local native plants for their own sake, but as food for these creatures. So we have to like chewed leaves. We have to learn to like chewed leaves. And so, yes, if I can go on to talk to the speciescape. So this, the first point is about the bulk of animals on Earth being small creatures. And this speciescape is an illustration that shows a representation of the numbers of species in 17 different phyla. And they're the larger phyla. And there's 33 distinct groupings of animals. The size of each animal presented compared to the area of the whole graphic suggests how biodiverse that grouping is. So the size represents the number of species, not the projected number of individuals. So the creatures that we're more familiar with, and the ones we most often speak about, are represented by the bird, which is up in the air there, the fish, the frog, which also represents reptiles, and the elk. And the elk is a bit harder to see. It's just underneath the mushrooms. The elk represents all mammals, including us. So I like this particular image because it puts the perspective of mammals in terms of species diversity for me. So every other animal on this slide, the fly, the spider, the mollusk, the sea star, the jellyfish, the earthworm, the roundworm, the flatworm, and the protozoan, are invertebrates, and they're just a selection of what these other invertebrate life forms are. So far, we've only identified about 1.5 million invertebrates known to science, and we're still counting, and we simply don't know how many there are on Earth. Whereas most of the animals with backbones, that is the vertebrates, have been identified, and there's 72,500 or so of them. So add to this that each of these small creatures has multiple relationships with other creatures, plants, food sources that provide their habitat needs, also for shelter and mates. You can start seeing a little of the complexity of our beautiful world. And I'm only lightly skimming the surface here. No, not yet, please. Next, I've still got to go. So Dick, if you can go back. The role of food plants is plant-eating insects is in our gardens and other ecological systems is to convert the energy of the sun that the sun provides into carbohydrates. And carbohydrate production gives the plants the capacity to grow, to produce plant defense chemicals, which are very important. And then for those creatures that can eat the plants with those defense chemicals, it allows these creatures to process that carbohydrate into high protein packages, and we'll just call them caterpillars and other insects. A further thing to consider here is that all life forms on Earth actually evolved in a particular place or region and in relationship with their food sources, and all the life forms in that habitat and ecosystem meeting their own habitat needs. So every life form has its own specific relationships, and no insect or other life form is interchangeable in that system without affecting these relationships. So yeah, so now if I can move on to my second talking point. So moving from the very general of the speciescape to the very specific, I'll just tell you one little case study of a plant insect predator interaction from my own garden. So in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, 200 butterfly species use 360 food plants for their caterpillars. One of these is this little plant with the little yellow flower that looks a bit like Easter cassia, but isn't. It's a scrambler called Senna gaudichaudii, or climbing senna. This plant supports the 4 butterflies, the yellow migrant, along with the small grass yellow, the large grass yellow, and the pale ciliated blue. And I've also observed the large brown bean bug making good use of the seed pods, and therefore preventing this rather prolific seed-producing plant from becoming overly dominant in any setting. And that control function is incredibly important in these herbivorous relationships. No butterfly species are known to require specific plants for nectar. They can often visit a variety of flowers. However, when it comes to native bees, some are much more specific, and some plants like this one require very particular kinds of bees to be pollinated. So this center is in a group of plants that need to be pollinated by what are called buzz pollinating bees. This includes multiple species of blue-banded bees, carpenter bees, and teddy bear bees, all of them being in the genus Amygilla. So it's feeding lots of animals. Because of the plant is so productive for caterpillars, I've observed small birds, including a grey fantail and a female robin, not common in inner city suburbs, visiting the plant and hiding from other birds in its dense growth. Then they were flying out and harvesting the butterflies that were eating the plant. Also on the slide, and a bit much harder to see, in the center down the bottom is two caterpillars on leaves. The top caterpillar, about 2/3 of the way along its length, has a white dot on it, which is the egg of a parasitic fly called a tachinid fly. So this larva will eat the caterpillar. And so the caterpillar that are eating this plant are in turn food for vertebrates such as birds and also other predatory insects. So plant-eating insects play a very important role and food source for other animals. Some 95% of all named animals on Earth are invertebrates, and 34% of all those named animals are plant-eating insects. So this is a place where we can make a really big difference. So the other thing is that local native plants are known to feed a much wider range of plant-eating insects than introduced plants, and they also feed many more specialists than generalists. Usually the introduced plants can only feed generalists, not always, but in the bulk. So from work done by Darryl Jones at Griffith Uni, Professor Darryl Jones, I should say, he states that all terrestrial Australian birds feed their nestlings insects, irrespective of what they eat as adults. So from the biodiversity that native plants support and the sheer spectrum of biodiversity there is, it becomes clearer just how important local native plants are if we want to maintain biodiversity. So to move on to the third topic, which is then a bit more of a case study about my garden and some of the contribution that a wildlife garden based on insect supporting plants can have. So and doing this in revegetation and in parks as well. Having bought my property in late 1987, I think the work I've been doing demonstrates the idea really well. On the left-hand side are pictures, well, a good picture of my thumb, but forgive me for that one. That was the house back in the front and the back in 1987. And it was basically green desolation to begin with. It was open and bare. It had a veggie patch with vegetables in rows down the back and a small number of Mediterranean fruit trees. And so from there, the journey began. The first few butterfly host plants were planted. Oh, sorry, on the right side of the screen is what the garden looked like from about the same point in 2008, late 2018, sorry. So we started planting butterfly host plants, both local natives and sometimes like rarer species along the fence lines, and some introduced known butterfly host plants. And along the way, we added more plants that we can share with invertebrates, and in particular, fruiting scramblers like Milla and zigzag vine, because we can share the food they produce, along with the small tree, the native mulberry, were added to the mix. And the garden still reflects the mix. So over 90 different butterfly host plants had been planted in that small area of 405 square meters. and droughts and attendant water restrictions have resulted in the demise of those with high watering needs, as has competition as things got bigger. So there's about 50 species left in the garden with not much room to move for any of them. Over the 33 years of development, the garden's development, I've raised just shy of 50 different butterfly species and a whole bunch of other creatures from the plants grown in the garden. So I've been in a position to observe the various species and their interactions and the ebb and flow of their populations and what happens when a population gets bigger, and all the creatures that then come in to start eating them, and then watch the observable inevitable crash. So, but if I had my time again for my garden and for the revegetation role I played at Woodford over the last 16 years or so, or if I had land that was less modified than my block, I'd take a completely different approach now. I'd basically look at what the original ecosystem was, what the plant lists were for that, and also look at other local drier ecosystems that are nearby and what species occurred there, and choose from those lists. My selection of plants would then be much less random than it is now. But all that said, the process has afforded me an excellent learning experience, and now shared in the book. And if you could just quickly move to the last slide. So I'm hoping that I've introduced you to some desire to learn to love larval life forms, to boost beautiful and bountiful biodiversity near you, nurture nature near you. I was having fun with alliteration this day, and let life thrive and flourish in local places and spaces. And you only need to go for a nice little walk in some bit of the country where there's not been much modification of the land, and you would see what I mean. I'd really like to thank Dick for co-authoring this book with me. And now I have some questions for you, Dick.
Thanks, Helen. That was really good.
So because a lot of your work was vastly more practical than what I was trying to discuss. So what are a few of the things that gardeners can do to support wildlife in their gardens?
Yeah, well, the first thing you can do, I think, as you've already got the message from Helen, is to grow a diverse range of local native plants. That's our number one message. And within that range of local native plants, obviously include host plants for caterpillars, for butterflies and moths, but also flowering and seeding plants to feed their adults and many other insects and birds. Plants whose leaves are food for many beetles and other insects, and plants that provide hiding spaces and shelter. So the second thing I'd say is to leave the old and the dead in place. So our long-standing superstition in humanity against disturbing the dead also applies to the rest of the natural world as well. For example, dead limbs on trees provide roosting spots for birds and webs for spiders. Hollows in old trees are nesting places, not only for birds, but for spiders, beetles, bats, reptiles, possums, and gliders. And leaf litter is food for moth larvae, native cockroaches, mites, and springtails, amongst many others. So leave the stuff on the ground. And the third thing I'd say is provide water. A lot of us might have garden ponds or bird baths, and they can each have a role, but probably one of the best ones is a naturally boggy area in your garden, or a bog garden that you can create yourself. These are great places for many insects to hang out and quench their thirst, and also for a lot of the host plants that like relatively moist conditions. But don't forget, probably the best way to hold water in your garden and provide it to the living creatures in your garden is to ensure that your soil is rich in organic matter and spongy humus. So they're just a few of the things that you can do, and there's many more listed in the book.
Okay, yeah. So, and yeah, there's a whole lot more suggestions, and they're great. So you're interested in bush food. What are a couple of your favorite bush food plants that are really good at attracting wildlife to your garden?
Well, there's lots, but I'm just picking two out. The native mulberry, some of you may know it. It's a fast-growing shrub that has juicy small fruit that can be quite sweet and tasty. It's not only the host plant for a number of butterflies and moths, but it's a great attractor of many other insects. Helen calls them a smorgasbord plant. The other insects including small spiders, beetles, bugs and flies, amongst others. It's a perfect plant to start growing your biodiverse backyard because it's fast growing. It'll bring the insects very quickly and your kids and grandkids will enjoy eating its fruit. The other one I'd say, picking out of many, is the lemon myrtle. Many of you will know this one. It's a small tree with fragrant lemon-scented leaves that makes refreshing tea or drink in summer. And it's covered in small creamy white flowers in summer. And the flowers in turn are covered in masses of insects, including native bees, butterflies and beetles, all enjoying its copious sweet nectar. It can be a great screen tree from your ugly neighbour's backyard, and you can dry the leaves to make a lemon-scented spice to be using in pesto, cakes and desserts. So once again, there are many more interesting and tasty bush foods mentioned in our book.
There's an amazing selection. So you have a food garden at home, and you also help look after orchards and forest gardens at Northey Street City Farm. Please just tell us what you're doing about bringing more biodiversity to those spaces.
Yeah, well, at home, I've mainly native plants in my front garden, including some bush foods, and I planted more smaller native plants around and between those native trees. These include shrubs, ground covers and vines. And in my back garden, it's mainly a food garden, fruit and veggies, but I've been adding native grasses such as kangaroo grass, a native legume such as the sennas, the one that Helen mentioned, and a couple of others, and also Cullen tenax or emu foot. And also flowering plants, including native daisies, hibiscuses, and love flower among the veggies and fruit trees. And I've selected these because they're mostly either native host plants for the larvae of insects, and also flowering plants that provide nectar and pollen for the adult insects. At Northey Street City Farm, which many of you would probably know, there's a lot of established plants there already, both native and exotic. So what we've done over the last couple of years is plant a lot of native plants as infill plants amongst the existing trees. And we're redesigning an old orchard to include a mix of native and exotic fruit trees, shrubs, vines and ground covers, as well as a bog garden. So as in my home garden, most of the smaller infill plants we're planting at the farm are plants that are either host plants for insect larvae or plants that have flowers that provide nectar and pollen for the adult insects. We're also growing thorny, prickly and dense plants to provide habitat and shelter for insects and small birds. And we're leaving bogs and leaf litter on the ground. And of course, many of the plants are also bush foods. And as once again, there's, I suppose I'd just say that we're on a journey. We're not experts by any means in translating this sort of ecological knowledge into what we do in our gardens and in our bush re-veg areas, but we think we're on the right track here, and we're certainly having some interesting results in seeing lots more insects already, both at home and at Northey Street City Farm. So now I'd just like to show you a few images, if I can wrangle the technology once again, to highlight what I've just been saying. So most of us probably already have the message that flowering native plants that are good nectar producers will attract quite a few insects to your garden. And just some of the ones showing you here on the top left, the grevillea with the teddy bear bee and the honey bee. They look very similar, but the teddy bear's sort of fatter and there's the honey bee just above it. Then in the middle at the top, you've got the pig face, which is another coastal sort of bush food and ground covering plant that has a really interesting salty pear type, salty strawberry type fruit. But its flowers also are good pollen and nectar sources. And in this case, you can see a stingless bee in the pig face flower. Corimbia or bloodwood is one of the gum trees, and they're all that family of Myrtaceae are very good at attracting in a whole range of insects to both their pollen and their nectar. And here you've got this rather smart looking fiddler beetle, and once again with some native stingless bees. Down the bottom right, we've got the Melaleuca, the red flowering Melaleuca with the scarlet Jezebel adult butterfly, and that's a handsome pair, those two. In the middle at the bottom, the fanflower, which is another insect feeding plant and a good ground cover. And then on the left, the blackthorn or Berseria spinosa with the indigo flash butterfly. So growing native plants that flower is certainly a good thing to do, but probably not as many people know or knew before tonight that it's just as important, if not more important, to grow the host plants. Helen's talked about butterfly host plants and butterfly caterpillars. I thought I'd just stand up for the moths, because they're actually many more moths than butterflies. We don't know as many or as much about them, but some of their host plants are eucalypts. The old gum tree's got a bit of a bad rap following the bush flies, because they are very flammable, and they're probably not the best for a West End or Dutton Park backyard, but certainly if you've got acreage or you're doing bush re-veg, we tend to forget about the eucalypts. But eucalypt leaves and bark are hosts for over 100 moth caterpillar, and the leaf litter of eucalypts is food plants for another 20 or more moth and their caterpillars at least. So there, and of course, Helen and I on a bushwalk last weekend, and their leaves are also attract numerous and food for a range of other insects. So don't forget the old gum trees. Banksias are also a common bush plant that many of you would know, and they're host plants for this one, particularly the double-headed hawk moth larvae, which is quite a spectacular moth, and that's a good plant for them. And then on the right top here, we've got the native mulberry that I've talked about before. And this is another hawk moth caterpillar that was seen on the native mulberry at Northey Street. And then down the bottom right, we've got another fairly spectacular moth larvae, the Joseph's coat moth. It's caterpillar, and while a lot of adult moths are fairly drab, this is an exception. The coat moth caterpillar, coat moth itself, the adult, is quite spectacular as well. And that just shows the middle bottom shows you the slender grape growing as a nice little ground cover, and also it'll grow up trees and shrubs. And then on the bottom left, we've got another moth larvae. This is a noctuid moth larvae, a caterpillar, and eating a native flig. And you can see Helen's point about look out for chewed leaves, and then you'll often find these insects putting the chew marks on them. And then the third and last slide I just want to share with you is about bush foods. As you've gathered, I'm a bit of a bush foods freak. And these are just some of the interesting bush foods that you can grow in your garden and that will attract some of these amazing butterflies. So the zigzag vine on the left top has a very tangy, sort of almost sherbety type fruit. It's a slow growing vine, but very hardy, grows up into the canopy and drops these fruit, and they're really quite something special. But it's also the host plant for a number of butterflies, including the four-barred swallowtail and the pale triangle. The one at the middle and the top is the lemon aspen. That's a gourmet bush food. Those fruit in the middle, they're a bit like sort of tangy lemon peel, and that's used in a lot of gourmet bush food sauces and spices, sauces and desserts. And this is a host for several gellichid moth caterpillars. The millimilla vine on top right, another really lovely fruit to eat. It's full of lycopene and it's quite a good health food, but it's also the host plant for the indigo flash, which is quite a interesting and spectacular butterfly. Down the bottom right, the finger lime, which many of you will know, has these finger-shaped fruit that are quite tangy and make good drinks and jams and sauces. And it's a host for three of the swallowtail butterflies, the orchard swallowtail, the dainty swallowtail and the fuscous swallowtail. And this is one of these thorny plants that I talked about earlier, which is also very good to have a few of these around your backyard, because the little birds like the wrens and the finches can nest in there and away from the predation by the big birds like the butcher birds and the crows and magpies. The bottom center is the sandpaper fig, a really yummy fruit. As long as they're growing, they need to have their roots in moist area. So once again, if you've got a bit of a creek or a boggy area, sandpaper fig grows really well there. And they're a host for a couple of butterflies, the purple moonbeam and the common crow. And then last but not least, the macadamia, which you'd all know. It's another one of these smorgasbord trees, hosting a number of butterflies, including the bright cornelian and a number of other butterflies in that same blue or lycaenid family. It's a great attractor of stingless bees, some of the moth caterpillars, and a number of other insects. So I hope these limited number of slides of images, of which there are many more in the book, have given you a taste of the sort of plants that you can grow in your backyard or on your bush re-veg block or in your acreage to attract these insects to your backyard and create that backyard biodiversity. So I think now it's time that we sort of hand over to our host, Emma Kate, who's going to encourage you to ask us some questions and give us some feedback.
Yeah, we've got lots of questions come through and lots of feedback. I'll start up the top. Whoops, I'm just going to swap my screen back. There we go. So, where to begin? So, there are a few people who are asking about what's covered in the book. So which examples, Neil has asked whether you cover the whole of Australia in the book, or if it's more centered on New South Wales or elsewhere.
It's specific. The book is generally applicable in terms of its ecological approach, but the examples are from the Macleay-McPherson overlap, which is the region of southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, which is a particularly biodiverse region where temperate and subtropical zones overlap. And so we've got 200 of Australia's 400 butterflies by way of example, but it's across the board. It's a very biodiverse region here. So, and a lot of those creatures do range much further, but where our efforts are for this region, because plants and animals are regional. They all have ranges.
Great, thank you. We've had quite a few people, Joe, asking about the mulberries that you were talking about. So somebody said, how do we identify one? Somebody else has said, are there any local stockists for them? Can you talk a little bit more about them? There are quite a lot of people curious.
Yeah, the native mulberry, to identify it, it grows probably no more than about 3 to 4 meters. It's a sort of a bushy shrub. It's very fast growing, and it has sort of glossy green leaves that are a duller grey colour underneath, and little fruit. For quite a long time in the year, the fruit are about the size of your little fingernail, or a bit smaller, and they're a translucent whitey colour. They often have chewed leaves because of all the insects that come on them. In terms of getting hold of them, our book actually lists a number of nurseries in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, not only in Brisbane and Greater Brisbane, but in down to northern New South Wales and up to the Sunshine Coast hinterland, the Gold Coast. So that, but they're probably a sort of plant you'd be able to get there, or in some of the bush care nurseries as well.
All right, great, thank you.
I just need to add, it comes in male and female trees. The native mulberry comes in male and female trees. because you're wanting the female, but you need a male to pollinate the female.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Yep.
Sorry, it's just people get confused when their mulberry tree doesn't produce fruit.
No, that's good. That's good. It's good to clarify that as well, because a few people are interested in obtaining them by the sound of it. So Mark has asked what you both think about rewilding of landscapes, the reintroduction of native species, and regenerative farming. And he said, can rewilding and regenerative farming be complementary? And what can this type of book fit in with those two concepts?
Oh, that's a big question.
Big question.
We've actually targeted this for gardeners. The ecological principles we're talking about apply across the board. And so I'm not necessarily totally up on the specifics of regenerative gardening. The core premise is that we need to be growing local native species to be bringing back the ecosystem that was present before we modified the land really massively. And to the extent that that principle is applicable across the other practices, it's certainly applicable to bush regeneration, and it's certainly a rewilding concept. But yeah, if the process is about using local native plants, then the book fits with it quite well, because it's applicable on a wider scale, but our aim is to talk to gardeners so that we start actually helping people understand the complexity of this stuff and how important it is to be actually understanding.
Thanks, Helen. If I could just add there, I mean, I agree it's entirely directed mainly at gardeners, but I think the rewilding concept sort of has come out of Europe, but a lot of the rewilding that's been going on in Australia has been under the rubric of bush revegetation or shelter belts or regenerative agriculture. And I think what this book brings to those is that a renewed focus on not only the little creatures, but the little plants. So a lot of bush revegetation has planted larger shrubs and trees and done some amazing rewilding of previously degraded or denuded areas. But what we're saying is that we need to bring in a lot of the smaller infield plants to bring back a lot of these creatures as well, because the big plants need the little plants to bring the pollinators for them and the things they're going to eat and recycle their leaves back into the soil and all the functions that we've already talked about in the ecological processes.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So on the topic of home gardening, we've had a couple of different questions about that. So somebody's asked about what's one thing that you can do to now to help improve insects coming into your garden. And somebody else has mentioned that they live in an apartment and they're wondering about attracting good insects with plants that they may have on a balcony, for example, or a small terrace.
I guess part of the understanding we're trying to engage with is that there are no such thing as good and bad insects. There's just creatures that eat different things in an ecosystem, and some of them we happen to not like if they happen to be eating our food. And the good bugs need the bad bugs anyway, because otherwise they can't sustain a population of their own. So it's the ecological principles that we're trying to help people understand are really important in this. If you've got a balcony, there are a few plants that you can grow in pots. There's a few native figs that will bring the common crow butterfly. I think one of them was Ficus macrophylla, Ficus benjamina, baby ben fig, but I don't believe it's a local native. You could be growing some citrus in pots as well, and you'll get a number of, potentially 3 butterflies will eventually find that, but mostly the orchard swallowtail will. The more you have isolated plants in isolated places, the more you're likely to end up with other things happening like defoliation and a whole lot of other stuff. So yeah, it's not ideal, but it's a lot of fun to grow plants in pots in the smallest. You can grow different things on windowsill ledges as well. It is something I plan to write something about, but this book came first.
And if I could just add there that what you can do is get hold of the book, go to the appendices, and there's one there that lists all the plants that we've talked about and many more. And you can pick some of those. They've listed under different sizes and forms, like vines or creepers, large trees, small trees, shrubs, and so on. And pick a few that suit for your place, and then contact some of the nurseries also listed in another appendix, and head on down there and talk to the nursery owners, because they're often quite knowledgeable about what goes well in your local area. So combining those sources of information and checking out the nurseries, you should be able to come away with something that can fit into your back garden. And if you need any advice about how to fit things in, there's also a chapter there on a very basic introduction to designing your garden as well.
Awesome, thank you. Somebody has just added there as well to get your neighbours in apartments to grow plants on their balconies too.
Yeah, great idea. Yep.
Yeah, and actually start creating wall gardens from local native plants, climbers, because what we're doing is we're mostly using introduced plants in nearly all those situations, and they're not going to support much biodiversity, not as much as a local native plant would.
Amanda and Gav have asked if you could explain a little more about why attracting local insects is good for veggie gardens. So maybe hinting on that, but on that idea of bad bugs that you mentioned that a lot of us have, Helen, ones that eat our food.
Yeah, so the more biodiversity you've got, the more you're likely to have creatures that are eating your creatures on your host plants. And some of those are specialists and some of them are generalists. But part of it arose out of an observation of my own. I would grow herbs on my windowsill, and the ants would start bringing in bunches of aphids and a whole lot of things, and the herbs would start looking dreadful. And after a while, I'd take pity on the plant and put it down in a little patch of other pot plants in an area that's very diverse. And really frequently, within a day or two or three, whatever was actually eating the plant is gone. And I'm not seeing what's eating it, but I know that the sheer biodiversity that that patch has, there's just a much bigger chance for predators to be there that eat those, that's eating whatever's eating my plant. It doesn't work every time, but it works really consistently. So nymph grasshoppers on basil, if you've got basil growing out in the open, it'll get defoliated by nymph grasshoppers if there's a mass emergence. But I would put the basil that I had in a more isolated spot in this patch with other plants, and within 2 to 3 days, all the little nymph grasshoppers were gone. I did have a few holes in my leaves, but I like holes in leaves. So, so that was a sort of a thought, but like it's anecdotal. It's not, it's citizen science that's anecdotal at this point. Hopefully that answered that question. But Dick, did you have something to add?
Oh no, I think you've done well. I mean, even the birds, you know, getting the thorny and prickly plants so the birds can nest, and the birds will eat a lot of those grasshoppers and insects as well. And as Ellen, the other thing that I've discovered recently is the myriad of little wasps. And when you've got little wasps, they're almost certainly laying eggs in caterpillars and getting rid of some of those ones that might be worrying your plants.
Yep.
Thank you. So I'm conscious of the time, so I think that we'll stick with 2 more. And I have promised Dick and Helen that I'll send them a transcript of the chat box. So if your question didn't get answered, they will receive it, and you can email me at Avid Reader, and I'm happy to pass it along to them both.
We'll do that.
Lovely, thank you. So somebody has said, if you're looking to revegetate, is there a good place to find lists of plants that may have once grown in your suburb? Is there a resource, a good?
Yes,
this is a plan. Sorry.
Yeah, there are. So, you go, Helen. You go.
This is what I was alluding to. Starting with regional ecosystems, and the intention is for the next edition to elaborate that much more in detail. But if you can work out what regional ecosystem the spot is in and find that regional ecosystem number elsewhere, then WildNet has lists of the animals that have been surveyed and plants that have been surveyed as occurring there. So you're matching regional ecosystem numbers, and it's a bit too, I'm still trying to work out how to write it so it's a simple procedure. It's a very complex procedure to try to turn into like easy words to use. So.
No, it's not, Helen. You haven't read the appendix really well, obviously.
I know there's
in one of our
appendixes. I meant the process of going to global Queensland and actually looking up the regional ecosystems. That's complex.
Well, yes, but the links are in our appendix in our book, and you need to go to one appendix to identify where your place in the world is and find the regional ecosystem, and then another one to find the plants that commonly occur in that regional ecosystem. Just one word of warning there that they mightn't always have all the little plants. They'll certainly have the big ones, but some of your local nurseries will have a lot of information about those plants that occur in the local regional ecosystems. Yep.
Lovely, thank you both. So for the last question, a few people have asked about how you approached writing this book. So can you talk a little bit about that before we're also getting lots of thank you messages and complimentary messages through. So I'm promising everybody now that after this one, I will invite you all to come off mute so that you can join me in thanking Dick and Helen.
Oh, how to answer that? We started having lots of meetings and working out who was doing what bit of writing, and we ended up around the start of COVID. We just set up Dick actually did the work, set up an outline of the sorts of chapters we thought we'd have on a Google Doc. And for most of COVID, we've actually been sort of meeting by like doing work in between times and filling in the blanks and editing each other's work. And it's been a wonderful collaborative process. And at times I had more ideas than I could get words to describe, and Dick was able to turn them into words that made much more sense than mine. And so I guess it was because our knowledge, we'd had enough discussions to realize that our knowledge bases were very complementary. And the other place we'd started was, we'd actually started writing another book, but it was becoming too ponderous. And we did a workshop last year at Northeast Street in September to start trialing some of the content. So it was a bit of a preview of the preview. And then based on that feedback and what people, we set up the book skeleton, or Dick set up the book skeleton. And and the outcome is I'm very grateful for COVID.
I suppose if I could just add there, the other sources of inspiration we got were from both academic science and also citizen science. So we were able to, as all these horrendous reports that some of you will have heard about the decline of insects have been hitting the media, we were able to go back over the last year or two, we were able to go back to the source documents for those and find them particularly in places like Europe and North America. But also not only the bad news, but we were inspired by some of the writing, particularly from North America, about what you can do in your own backyard. And we've sort of wanted to translate some of those ideas from North America to our part of the world in the McLean-McPherson overlap here. And of course, the final inspiration was citizen science. There's so much citizen science out there now on wonderful apps like iNaturalist and Apples of Living Australia and local groups doing things. And they've also been a source of information and inspiration to us as well.
Lovely, thank you. Well, congratulations to you both. It's a brilliant achievement, and we're having lots of comments coming through saying that people are excited to get the book. They're saying this has been an extraordinarily brilliant event. Thank you all so much. It's been most informative. So I think now I'll invite you all to take yourselves off mute so that you can join me in thanking Dick and Helen for tonight's discussion. Congratulations again. You should now all be able to take yourselves off mute.
Yep, great. Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well done, Helen and Dick. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Avid Reader.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Well done,
Thank
Dick.
you. Have a lovely
Yeah, great,
evening.
very informative.
That's brilliant. So thank
That
you.
was great. Thank you.
Yeah.